This week, we continue with the story of Joseph, which we began last week, picking up at the 45th chapter. Listen now to what the Spirit is saying to her church this day. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." For the famine had been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt, and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here." Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Years ago, I saw the play Boy, based on the life of David Reimer. David Reimer was born a male in 1965, but at the encouragement of a psychologist, David was raised a female and underwent gender reassignment surgery. David Reimer was unknowingly an experimental subject in psychologist David Money's research on gender. The play follows the heartbreaking story of David's life and the struggles of his parents as they navigate the decisions to raise David as Samantha. There is a sentence in the play by the young boy where he says, "I was born a boy, but then there was an accident." The artistic director of the play latched on to this sentence from the script, saying, "Evidently, this kind of sentence can be spoken by all of us. I was this, but then something happened." And after the something happened, something out of our control, something not planned, something terrible, or even something wonderful, our lives changed forever. There is no such thing as an ordinary life, an ordinary person. Biographies are accounts of men and women who were born one way, and then something happened, and life changed forever. It's impossible not to understand biographies as a witness to the mystery and miracle that is human life. I was this, but then something happened. I was Joseph, favorite son of Jacob, but then my brothers sold me into slavery. Our scripture reading today is a continuation of last week's story where Joseph's brothers threw him in a pit and then sold him to passing merchants. A lot happens between the text we read last week and what we just read this morning, so bear with me while I give you the quick summary. After they sold him, Joseph's brothers go home and tell their father that Joseph was killed by a wild animal, which breaks their father's heart. Meanwhile, the merchants who bought Joseph put him back on the market and sell him as a slave to a powerful Egyptian. And Joseph works as a dedicated servant. But even still, he is accused of a crime he did not commit, and he's thrown in prison. But while he's in prison, he befriends a couple of people who have dreams. And it turns out that Joseph has a knack for interpreting dreams. And news of his dream interpretations get to Pharaoh. And Joseph gains Pharaoh's respect and then ultimately gives Joseph a position of power in the Egyptian government. Joseph rules over the food supply. He gets to decide who gets food and how much they should pay for it. It is a very important job, even under ordinary circumstances, but you can imagine how important it is when a famine descends on the land. Joseph's family is affected by the famine, and his brothers are dying of hunger. So his dad tells them to travel to Egypt and ask for grain from their supply. When they show up, Joseph recognizes his brothers immediately, but the brothers don't recognize Joseph. In today's text, it is another encounter between Joseph and his brothers, who have come back to Egypt again asking for food. I was Joseph, favorite son of Jacob, but then my brothers sold me into slavery. How will Joseph tell his story? He suffered countless misfortunes. Now he's rich and powerful. He could stick it to his brothers if he wanted to, and who would fault him? Bitterness and retribution seem like the most logical response. When you're in the wilderness, in unknown and unfamiliar territory, be that a relationship, a new job, unemployment, a strange parent-child relationship, financial uncertainty, all sorts of things lead us into the unknown terrain of the wilderness. However you get there, when you're in the wilderness, the question, how did I get here? Or how did we get here? Quickly casts its shadow over every other thought. Naturally, we humans respond to this question by rehearsing the events in our minds. I was this, but then something happened. It's in the wilderness, while we're dwelling on the events that led us there in the first place, that we are faced with a decision about how we will tell our story. Priest Henry Nouwen says, there are different ways to tell our story. There are two ways of telling your story, he says. One is to tell it compulsively and urgently, to keep returning to it because you see your present suffering as the result of your past experiences. Or you can tell your story from the place where it no longer dominates you. You can speak about it with a certain distance and see it as the way to your present freedom. The compulsion to tell your story is gone. It's lost its weight, and instead can be remembered as God's way of making you more compassionate and understanding toward others. I was Joseph, favorite son of Jacob, but then my brothers sold me into slavery. How will Joseph tell his story? Will he be defined by his past, using all that has happened as rationale for transmitting his pain to others? Or will he bring his past with him so it can inform the present moment without dominating it? I was Joseph, favorite son of Jacob, but then my brothers sold me into slavery. I think Joseph shows us what it's like to tell our story with freedom. In today's scripture, when he could have returned the pain and rejection he'd suffered at the hands of his brothers, he doesn't punch back. Instead, he seeks a connection with his family, choosing a path that transforms the future for everyone involved. Weeping, he says to his brothers, "Come closer to me," inviting them back into relationship with him. I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt, and now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you. If pain is not transformed, it is transmitted, as Richard Rohr says. And how we tell our stories is a part of that transformation process. When we tell our stories compulsively, seeing our present suffering as a result of the past, we let the pain linger and transmit it on to others. Telling our stories in freedom allows us to host the hidden, inscrutable, unresolved purpose of God for a life beyond our control. Telling our stories with freedom allows us to trust that there is a larger purpose being acted out in and through us, which we must honor and to which we must respond, even if it means denying the first raw inclination of hate and anger. I was this, but then something happened. How you fill in the second part of that sentence is a good indicator of how you're telling your story. Is it a litany of open wounds or a grocery list of the ways you've been wronged? Is it inconsolable tears or the pain of a heart shattered into a million pieces? It's good to name those things, but if we don't go past them, then we will simply transmit our pain to others. If, however, we can acknowledge that we're part of a larger story, not our own, then we become open to the possibility of our pain being transformed. I was Joseph, favorite son of Jacob, but then my brothers sold me into slavery. In the years of my estrangement from my family, I have grown more courageous and more tender. My story is not separate from God's story. I want to tell you the story of Liz Humphrey, who is now known as Liz Huntley. Liz grew up in Alabama, and her mother was known as Queen Bee. Queen Bee was the largest heroin distributor in Alabama. When Liz was 5, her father was arrested, and her mother dropped her off at her grandmother's house and then disappeared forever. Liz found herself in what you would call a rough home. On her first day of kindergarten, Liz went to school alone. Her grandmother told her that when the teacher handed out the school papers, to have the teachers mark a red X where she would need to sign because there was no way she was going to waste time reading those. So when Liz's teacher approached her that first day of school, Liz said to her, "My name is Elizabeth Humphrey, and my grandmother told me to ask you to put red X's next to where she should sign." Liz said, "I was empty, I was lonely, I was scared, and my teacher could see it clear as day on my face." Her teacher responded, "Well, Elizabeth Humphrey, you are going to be the brightest student I've ever taught." No one had ever said anything like that to her, and that moment shaped the rest of her life. Not long after that, she heard her pastor preach on Joseph, and she said, "It was the first time in my life that I'd heard a story like my own." Liz was blown away at Joseph's response to his brothers after they'd abandoned him, and she was amazed at how much healing his actions created. She thought, I could be a force for good in the world and for my family. My pain could be transformed for good. Liz's parents weren't in the picture, so she couldn't pass that transformation on to them, but she has passed it on to future generations. I was a young girl, but then I was abandoned and left to fend for myself. Instead of searching for ways to get even or feeling stuck because of all that had happened to her, Liz began to tell and live her story from a place of freedom instead of pain. In college, Liz began mentoring young students that looked a lot like she did as a first grader, and she's never stopped mentoring young people. Liz went on to the University of Alabama Law School and clerked for several Supreme Court justices. She's now a litigator and child advocate. Because of her past, she never thought that she would be able to love and trust enough to have a family. But Liz and her husband are the proud parents of 3 children. She did not let the pain of her past define her future. Instead, she allowed that pain to be transformed into a career that brings healing for children in difficult situations. Maybe you aren't carrying pain right now. Maybe you feel like all this talk of the wilderness is overkill, and that's okay. It may not be now for you, but at some point, you will find yourself in a wilderness you didn't ask for, and the pain will compound. When that happens, the question we all face is what we're going to do with our past. How will we tell our story? Will you use your story as a way to transmit pain to others? Or will you tell your story with freedom, entertaining the idea that there is a larger purpose being worked out in and through you because your story cannot be untangled from God's story? Will you trust that your pain can be transformed? God's promise and our third lesson from the wilderness, thanks to Joseph, is that our stories are all tangled up with God's stories. I was in the wilderness, but then something happened. I began to entertain the thought that my story could not be separated from God's story, that by the grace of God, my pain could be transformed. My prayer for you and my prayer for me is that these promises become the story we tell. May it be so.